What's going on, everybody? It's your guy coming at you straight from the heart of the action today. We are going deep, and I mean deep, into the biggest geopolitical earthquake of 2026. And let me tell you, what we're watching right now is nothing less than the complete and total collapse of Russia's grand strategy, all happening in plain sight. While the United States just dropped the hammer they've been dreading since day one, let's rewind to the beginning of this year, January 2026. Vladimir Putin and his entire inner circle walked into this year convinced that it was their victory lap. That was the plan, plain simple, and arrogantly assumed they believed that by midsummer the Donbass front would be effectively finished. They thought Ukraine would be forced back to the negotiating table, not as an equal but as a beggar, with Moscow holding every single chip. They even bet that the United States, our United States, would slowly but surely accept the so-called reality that Ukraine couldn't win, and that Washington would eventually start leaning on Kiev to cut the best deal they could get, which in Moscow's mind meant surrender on Russian terms. That was the dream. That was the grand strategic vision. Well, fast forward 7 months, and 7 brutal, bloody months, that entire fantasy, it hasn't just failed, it has completely, catastrophically imploded. Not only did Russia's master plan blow up in their face, but the United States just pulled out the one single weapon that the Kremlin has feared above all others. And on top of that, and this is the part that really stings the relationship between Washington and Kyiv, it's not just back on track, it is hotter, stronger, and more locked in than at any point since President Trump returned to the White House. That is a 1-2-3 punch that Moscow never saw coming, and they have absolutely no answer for it. Now let's start with the big legislative hammer that just moved through our Senate, and I want you to pay close attention here, because this is history in the making. Literally hours after Senator Lindsey Graham's funeral, I'm talking within the same day the United States Senate held a vote that sent shockwaves all the way across the Atlantic. Straight into the Kremlin's basement, this was Graham's final piece of legislation, the bill he fought for until his very last breath, the issue he cared about more than almost anything else. And what does this bill do? It authorizes President Trump, our president, to impose massive crushing, economy-wrecking tariffs on any nation on this planet that continues to buy Russian oil or any other Russian energy products. The vote tally, 86 yeas, only 12 nays. That is not a close call. That is not a narrow margin. That is a bipartisan, bicameral level stamp of approval that says the United States Congress, on both sides of the aisle, is united on this issue. Graham's final political legacy is now one major procedural step away from becoming the law of the land, and everyone in Washington knows it. Now let me take a moment to remind everyone who Lindsey Graham really was, because his story matters here. For years, Graham was the single loudest, most relentless, most uncompromising Ukraine hawk in the entire United States Congress. He didn't just talk about supporting Ukraine, he made it his personal mission. He constantly pushed President Trump publicly and privately to get much tougher on Russia. He never bought into the idea that we could just negotiate our way out of this mess. He never believed that Putin could be trusted. And his core argument, the one that drove this entire bill, was absolutely brutal in its simplicity. Graham looked at Russia's so-called shadow fleet, those decrepit, uninsured, often aging tankers that sail under flags of convenience. And he realized that those ships are still pumping out hundreds of billions of dollars worth of crude oil and refined products every single year. And that money, that cash flow, that is the actual literal lifeblood of Putin's war machine. Graham understood something that too many people in the foreign policy establishment refuse to admit. If you cut that revenue stream, if you choke off that oil money, you don't just weaken Russia. You effectively cut the war off at its knees. No cash, no tanks, no cash, no missiles, no cash, no mercenaries. That was his logic, and it was airtight. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, is this bill already in effect? Not quite yet, but don't let that fool you. European media outlets are calling this vote mostly procedural, and they're technically not wrong. The House of Representatives already passed a very similar version of this bill weeks ago. So both chambers of our Congress are clearly, unequivocally on the same page. The only holdup right now is ironing out some minor technical differences between the two versions stuff that will get worked out in a conference committee. These tariffs aren't hitting anyone today or tomorrow, but everyone in DC, every foreign embassy, and every finance ministry from New Delhi to Ankara knows perfectly well that it's just a matter of time. Political news outlets inside the Beltway are already reporting that 62 senators have signed on as official co-sponsors. That means final passage in the Senate is highly likely, I'd say almost certain, and when it goes back to the House for a final concurrence vote, it's going through with room to spare. Now, there was a lot of confusion floating around online, and I saw this everywhere about the actual tariff rates. Some people screamed 100%. Others shouted 500%. So let me break it down exactly as it stands, because this is the kind of detail that matters when you're talking about real economic warfare. According to the actual legislative text and the reports that came out on July 28th, this bill contains two distinct layers of penalties. Layer 1, it gives the president the authority to impose up to 500% tariffs on all Russian goods exported directly to the United States. That includes everything oil, gas, metals, fertilizers, you name it. Layer 2, it slaps an additional 100% penalty tariff on any country that either buys the most Russian crude oil or actively helps Russia dodge existing international sanctions, things like facilitating transshipments, providing insurance, or using shell companies. Now, let's be honest about that 500% figure. That number is mostly symbolic. Why? Because in 2025, the United States only imported about $38 billion worth of total Russian goods. And that includes everything, not just energy. That's a drop in the bucket compared to our total import volume. So the direct tariff on Russian exports to America, not a huge deal in pure dollar terms. But that secondary 100% tariff, that is the real body blow. That is the heavy artillery, because it's not aimed at Russia directly. It's aimed at every single country on earth that still does business with Russia. The United States is essentially shifting the entire weight of economic pain from Moscow onto Moscow's customers. If you buy Russian oil, you pay the price not in rubles, but in lost access to the American market, and that, my friends, is a very, very heavy fist to the gut. And here's the bigger strategic message that came out of that Senate vote. The United States Senate still stands firmly, unequivocally, and overwhelmingly with Ukraine. This is not a debatable point. After President Trump returned to the White House, there was a rocky period. I am not going to sugarcoat it. Tensions flared, military aid was paused for a while, intelligence sharing got interrupted, there were sharp words exchanged publicly, but that chapter is now over. This bill is the hardest. Most concrete evidence yet that the U.S.-Ukraine relationship has not only recovered, it has actually gotten stronger and deeper than before. Let me give you the big picture numbers, because they're staggering. Since the full-scale invasion began, the United States, the European Union, Britain, Canada, Japan, Australia, and a whole coalition of other allies have imposed a total of 23,960 separate sanctions on Russia. I'll say that again, 23,960 individual sanction measures. And of that total, the United States alone has added 6,441 new sanctions since the war started. If you include the sanctions we had in place before the invasion going back to Crimea in 2014, our total comes to 7,392 separate punitive measures. That is an absolutely mind-boggling number. And here's the key takeaway: direct sanctions on Russia are already maxed out. There's barely any room left to add new ones without going into completely uncharted territory. So what's the new American strategy? It's a textbook case of secondary sanctions, the kind we've used against Iran, against North Korea, and against other pariah states. We're not just hitting the bully anymore. We're going after everyone who still buys lunch for the bully. We are targeting the enablers, the trade partners, the customers who are keeping Putin's economy on life support. That is the core logic of this bill. Now think about the impossible choice this creates for every major Russian oil buyer on the planet. Once this law is fully enacted, and I believe it will be, each of those countries faces a brutal zero-sum either-or decision. On one hand, they can keep buying cheap Russian crude, which saves them a few $billions on their energy bills. But on the other hand, if they do that, they risk losing access to the American market, the largest, most lucrative, most stable consumer market in the entire history of the world. That is not an abstract academic question. That is a cold, hard spreadsheet-driven economic calculation that finance ministers, trade negotiators, and heads of state from New Delhi to Ankara to Brasilia are running right now in real time. And if enough of those countries choose the latter, if they walk away from Russian energy to protect their American trade relationships, then Graham's bill becomes an absolute monster of economic warfare. The entire point is to choke off Russia's single biggest revenue stream, oil and gas exports. Moscow's own official forecast for 2026 projected that they would earn $1,137 billion from oil and gas this year. That is over $1 trillion, let that sink in. A giant chunk of that money goes straight into their exploding defense budget, which is already swallowing up over 40% of total government spending. That budget pays for missiles, tanks, artillery shells, drones, mercenary contracts, and everything else that keeps their war machine grinding forward. The United States strategy through this bill is to shrink that $1,137 billion down to a fraction, not by banning Russian oil ourselves, but by making sure nobody else on earth dares to buy it. And that is how you win an economic war without firing a single shot. So let's look at the actual trade map, because this is where it gets really interesting and really complicated if we're talking only about crude oil unrefined straight out of the ground. Russia's top customers right now are India, Turkey, the European Union, and Myanmar. Those are the big four in terms of volume, but if you expand the definition to include refined petroleum products like diesel, fuel oil, gasoline, and other derivatives, then you absolutely should, because they're just as valuable than you add Brazil, Singapore, and even Saudi Arabia to the potential target list. That is a wide net. And here's the geopolitical twist that makes this whole thing even more explosive. Many of these countries are not neutral bystanders, they are American allies, or at least strategic partners. Turkey is a NATO member, for heaven's sake. Saudi Arabia has deep, decades-long security and economic cooperation with the United States. The European Union is our longest-standing partner in the post-war order, and they are also one of Ukraine's biggest financial backers. So if the United States enforces this law to the fullest extent, if we really start slapping these tariffs on every major Russian oil buyer, we are essentially hitting our own friends. That sounds crazy on the surface, right? But look at the numbers, because this is where the math gets brutal. According to the U.S. Trade Representative's own data, the United States imported $103.8 billion worth of goods from India in 2025 alone. That's just from India. Now compare that to Russia's entire projected oil and gas revenue for this year, $113.7 billion. That means the value of India's exports to America is only about $10 billion less than Russia's total energy income for the entire year. $10 billion, that is not a huge gap. What that tells me, and what every finance ministry in the world is calculating right now, is that the economic weight of the American market far outweighs any short-term savings from Russian discount crude. And that is precisely why Washington has the nerve, the confidence, and the muscle to push this bill forward. Because we know we hold the bigger stick. We know we have the leverage, and we are not afraid to use it. Ukraine is watching all of this unfold with intense, laser-focused attention. What they want most, what they have been hoping for since day one, is for those major buyers to start walking away from Russian energy. If that happens, if India, Turkey, and the others start cutting their purchases, Moscow's fiscal house collapses. That would be a dream scenario for Kyiv and an absolute unmitigated catastrophe for the Kremlin. But honestly, and this is the part that really gets under Putin's skin, the tariffs themselves aren't even the thing that keeps him up at night. What really terrifies them is the broader, unmistakable message. U.S.-Ukraine relations are heating back up in a major way. Graham's bill is not an isolated event. It is not a one-off piece of legislation. It is the latest domino in a long chain of developments that are all pointing in the same direction. At the exact same time this bill was moving through the Senate, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky visited the White House and sat down with President Trump for a face-to-face meeting. And the photos from that meeting, let me tell you, they were night and day compared to what we saw just a year ago. Both men were smiling, standing shoulder to shoulder, looking comfortable and confident. And if you remember the icy tension, the sharp exchanges, and the public disagreements from earlier in President Trump's term, that image alone is worth 1,000 diplomatic cables. It sent a signal to every capital in the world that the relationship is not just repaired, it is reinvigorated. Zelensky himself said after the meeting that they focused on two major, concrete issues. First, the United States has now authorized Ukraine to produce Patriot interceptor missiles on their own soil. That is absolutely huge. We are not just sending them finished weapons systems anymore. We are giving them the actual technology, the blueprints, and the production know how to build one of the most advanced, most effective air defense systems in the entire world right inside their own factories. That is a game changer. Second, they revived high-level discussions on the diplomatic track on how to eventually move toward negotiations, but from a position of strength, not weakness. And here's the kicker that really drives this home. President Trump has already approved the initial transfer of some Patriot production technology to Ukraine. That means in the very near future, within months, not years, Ukraine will be able to manufacture these critical interceptors domestically. That significantly reduces their reliance on Western supply chains, which have been stretched thin, and it gives them a self-sustaining defensive edge that they have never had before. according to the Kyiv Post. Zelensky also met with top-level executives from Lockheed Martin, the primary manufacturer of the Patriot system, during that same visit. And Raytheon, another American defense giant, is also in active talks for joint production arrangements. If these deals go through, and it looks like they will, Ukraine will become integrated into the American military-industrial complex at a level we have never seen before with a non-NATO ally. That is not just support, that is strategic partnership for the long haul. But wait, there's more. There are credible reports that President Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, and even Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and a key advisor, are planning their first ever official visit to Ukraine in the coming weeks. Outside analysts and mainstream media outlets believe this trip is very likely about laying the groundwork for future peace negotiations and exploring broader bilateral cooperation in areas like reconstruction, energy, and investment. Every single one of these moves is a nightmare for Moscow. Every single one signals that the United States is doubling down on Ukraine, not backing off, not wavering, not getting tired. We are all in. Now contrast all of this with where we were just 12 months ago. In February 2025, Zelensky's last White House visit was cold. Freezing cold. The atmosphere was tense. The United States temporarily suspended military aid packages. Intelligence sharing was paused for a period. President Trump publicly called Zelensky a dictator. At one point, I remember that very clearly he repeatedly suggested, in public statements, that Ukraine should consider territorial concessions to end the war, and he held multiple phone calls, and even an in-person meeting with Vladimir Putin, leading many analysts around the world to believe that US-Russia relations were actually thawing, and that Washington might be drifting away from Kyiv. But 2026 flipped that whole script upside down. In June, President Trump publicly praised Zelensky as very brave and explicitly endorsed Ukraine's long-range strike campaigns against Russian military targets. Now, we have the Graham bill advancing through the Senate with overwhelming bipartisan support. We have Patriot technology transfers moving forward. We have joint defense production talks with Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. We have escalating diplomatic engagement at the highest levels. And we have a White House photo op that looks more like a summit between allies than a tense meeting between former adversaries. All of these together paint a crystal clear, undeniable picture. US-Ukraine relations are not just back, they are stronger, deeper, and more comprehensive than they have been at any point since President Trump took office. For Ukraine, that is an absolute game changer. For Russia, it is a brand new, increasingly desperate, and rapidly deteriorating situation. At minimum, the United States has now firmly, unambiguously re-anchored itself on Ukraine's side. And the level of support we are seeing right now is the most robust, the most extensive, and the most strategically significant of Trump's entire second term. More and more, it looks like this administration genuinely believes that Ukraine can actually win this war, not just survive, not just hold on, but win. And that means Russia's carefully laid strategic plans, built over years of brutal attrition, grinding warfare, and political manipulation, are crumbling piece by piece, day by day. Right now, Moscow can only sit and watch the disaster unfold in slow motion. Graham's bill has cleared its first critical Senate hurdle, and full passage is almost certain. And let's be completely honest, President Trump loves tariffs. He has always used them as leverage, as a negotiation weapon, as a blunt instrument to reshape trade relationships and force other countries to the table. Once this law is enacted, and I believe it will be, he will have clear, unambiguous legal authority, not only to crush Russian energy exports indirectly, but also to pressure major trading partners like India, Turkey, and even some European nations to make a choice for Trump. That is more leverage on the global stage. For Russia, that is a fresh, ongoing existential nightmare. If this legislation becomes final law in 2026, and all signs point that way, then this year could very well go down in history as the most painful, the most punishing, and the most strategically disastrous 12 months that Russia has faced since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But wait, because the economic pressure is only half of this story. And honestly, the military situation on the ground is even worse for Moscow. On the battlefield, Russia's performance is getting uglier by the day, and I mean ugly in every sense of the word. In the first 5 months of this year, January through May, Russian forces suffered an average of 30,000 to 34,000 casualties per month. That is killed and wounded combined, and those are conservative estimates. Then June hit, and in that single month alone, they lost a staggering 39,490 troops. That is a new record for the entire war. That is more than they have lost in any single month since February 2022. And that number is far, far more than they can possibly recruit each month through volunteers. Financial incentives or even forced conscription, the math simply does not work. More and more military analysts inside the Pentagon, inside NATO, and inside independent think tanks are now openly saying that Putin may have no choice but to order a new wave of mass mobilization, potentially calling up as many as 500,000 reservists. That is 500,000 men pulled out of factories, farms, and offices and thrown into the meat grinder. And that is the single thing that the Kremlin has been desperate to avoid at all costs. Putin has delayed a full-scale call-up for months and months, hoping to get past the State Duma elections before dropping that bomb. Why? Because he absolutely knows that a mass draft would be the single most unpopular domestic decision since the war began. It would trigger protests, social unrest, and potentially even political instability inside Russia. And he is terrified of that, and here is the truly insane part. All of those horrific, record-breaking casualties haven't bought them any meaningful territorial gains whatsoever. I mean, zero. The Russian advance has slowed to a crawl so slow that it is almost laughable if it weren't so tragic. Al Jazeera reported on July 3rd that if Russian forces keep advancing at their current pace, roughly 1 square kilometer per day, it would take them 14 years just to capture the entire Donetsk region. 14 years? Let that sink in. That is not a blitzkrieg. That is not a military operation. That is a stalemate with occasional tiny incremental movements. And the numbers back that up completely. According to the Institute for the Study of War, from December 2025 to May 2026, a full 6-month period, Russia's net new territorial control was only 40.64 square kilometers. I'll say that again, 40.64 square kilometers. Now compare that to the same period the previous year when they took over 15,015.84 square kilometers. That is a drop of over 92%. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces have been actively counterattacking since February and have recaptured more than 600 square kilometers of territory in that same time frame. So Russia is paying record high casualties for almost zero real estate gain, and in some sectors, they are actually losing ground. That is a failing strategy by any military metric you care to use. At the same time, Crimea is slowly but surely being strangled. Ukrainian forces are hitting transportation hubs, rail bridges, ferry crossings, and Russia's shadow fleet operating in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov almost every single day. Every successful strike cuts another supply line to the peninsula. And for Putin, Crimea is not just land, it is the ultimate trophy, the single most important symbol of his entire war gamble. It is the proof he points to when he tells the Russian people that their sacrifice has been worth it. But that grip is slipping. It is eroding. In fact, right now, Crimea might be closer to returning to Ukrainian control than at any point since 2014, and Kyiv hasn't even launched a major amphibious landing yet. That is how badly Russia's defensive posture has deteriorated. And let's talk about fuel, because this is hitting ordinary Russians where they live. Ukrainian long-range drones have been systematically, relentlessly hitting Russian oil refineries deep inside their own sovereign territory. Not just near the front lines, but hundreds of miles inside Russia. The result, severe, spreading fuel shortages are now affecting Crimea and even large parts of mainland Russia. Gas stations are shutting down left and right. I mean, entire chains are closing their doors. The ones that are still open have lines stretching for miles, literally miles, with angry, frustrated drivers waiting for hours just to fill their tanks. Because refinery capacity across Russia has dropped by about 40% due to these relentless drone attacks. The Kremlin has been forced to restrict fuel exports to other countries just to keep domestic supplies from running completely dry. Huge embarrassment for a country that styles itself or used to style itself as an energy superpower. Russia is now importing fuel from Belarus and Kazakhstan just to keep its own military and civilian sectors running. That is not a superpower, that is a country in crisis. But Ukrainian drones aren't just going after military bases and oil refineries anymore. They are also hitting Wildberries, Russia's largest e-commerce platform. And I want you to understand why that matters. Those giant warehouses don't just store consumer goods like clothes, electronics, and groceries. They also store military drones, spare parts for military equipment, electronics, communications gear, and all kinds of dual-use equipment that directly feed the Russian war machine. Those facilities have become a critical, integral part of Russia's military logistics network. And taking them out does double damage. It disrupts the military supply chain while also hitting the civilian economy and creating panic among ordinary Russian shoppers. The fact that these strikes keep succeeding over and over again, despite all of Russia's supposed air defense systems, shows that Russia's air defense can no longer protect key domestic targets. And the Russian people, they are watching all of this happen on their phones, on their TVs, and in their own neighborhoods in real time. The illusion of security, the myth of invincibility, is completely shattered. So now you have a triple-barreled converging pressure cooker. Military losses are mounting faster than they can recruit, faster than they can replace. Economic sanctions, led by the Graham bill and backed by the full weight of the United States, are about to squeeze their oil revenue into a lethal vice. And domestic infrastructure, from fuel supplies to warehouses to transportation networks, is under daily, persistent, increasingly effective attack. The war is no longer something far away on the front lines, something that only affects soldiers in foreign territories. It is now hitting Russian households directly. Gas is scarce, deliveries are delayed, prices are rising, and the government is running out of ways to pretend that everything is fine. And what is the Kremlin's response to all of this so far? It's been mostly silence or empty rhetoric. They don't have a good answer. They don't have a countermove because every lever they thought they controlled energy exports. Military escalation, Western fatigue has slipped through their fingers. One by one, 2026 was supposed to be Russia's year of victory. It was supposed to be the year they broke Ukraine's will. Instead, it is turning into a year of relentless pressure, strategic collapse, and looming domestic crisis. The United States has repositioned itself firmly, decisively behind Ukraine. The Congress is united on sanctions. The battlefield is bleeding Russia dry. And the Russian people are starting to feel the pain in ways that no propaganda campaign can hide. So let me ask you straight up, because I want to hear your take. Do you think Putin will actually pull the trigger on a mass mobilization of 500,000 more men risking open domestic unrest? Or will he try to wait out the Duma elections, hope the West blinks first, and pray that something changes in his favor? Drop your take in the comments section below, because this story is far from over and every single day brings new developments. That's it for today's full breakdown. I know we covered a lot, but this is too important to rush. Stay sharp, stay informed, keep your eyes open, and I will catch you right here in the next one.